Today is Tuesday, February 6, 2007, for the Rutgers Project on the Governor, the Brendan Byrne Archive. We're going to continue our discussion with Cliff Goldman, who was Deputy State Treasurer during the first part of the first Byrne administration and then became State Treasurer when Dick Leone left government.
When we left off, you said to me, next time ask me about John Baldwin.
Okay.
Why?
We were going into 1976, I think, and the income tax had not yet passed. But eventually it did pass in 1976, and I'm using John Baldwin as the persona of the bureaucracy that functions. When the income tax passed in July 1976, under that income tax and the homestead rebate that passed with it, the amount of paper that the state was about to handle was, I forget the exact number, but let's say 7 times as much as all the paper it handled before in all the departments. It was an enormous change. The withholding schedules had to get out, and the first withholding of income tax had to be in September of '76, 2 months later. And then, of course, the withholdings had to be made and paid, and the taxes, returns, and estimated taxes, and homestead rebate applications, and all this paperwork. So between the passage of the tax in July, mid-July, the tax division, Sid Glazer overseeing all of it, but John Baldwin, the deputy division director in charge of this operation. We worked to, first of all, we acquired a building in downtown Trenton, renovated it, bid out and purchased all these gigantic letter opening machines, you know, that you see on TV. Slice open envelopes, designed all the forms.
The building that taxation currently occupies?
The Scriver building.
That same building?
Well, the taxation is where it was, the offices, but the processing center is further, I forget the directions, but it used to be an old furniture store. And all of this went flawlessly. The rebate checks went out, and the signal determinant to me of all this was that in April of 1977, I got my state income tax refund before my federal income tax refund. All of this, you know, there's a larger point. Of course, this had a lot to do with the election going smoothly, because this is where people see how the government works. This isn't something you can spin or write press releases about. They either get their forms or they don't get them, or they get their refunds or they don't get them. And they did a fantastic job, but it in those days at least was part of a respect that political leaders had for the established bureaucracies that could function well and knew what they were doing. And I'm not sure how that's changed over time, but certainly in our years in Treasury Department, there was a succession of...
Let me ask you something. You talk about the vast increase in the amount of paper the government had to process. Earlier in the first interview we did, you, I think, spoke critically of a new education secretary coming in. I think it was Burke. And,
right.
and if, in rereading the transcript, it sounded as if you were saying he created a blizzard of paper.
Right.
And you were being critical of that. Is paper something that government should generally try to avoid?
Well, I don't think paper is a metaphor. I mean, here the paper was a check or an income tax form. That paper was paper which required activity on behalf of all the school districts and all the state education officials. like spinning wheels in a way to me. It's not the common use of the term paper in these two isn't appropriate, I don't think. But I remember I used to go to Rutgers basketball games. They had a good team in those years, and I'd always see Ray Bateman there. And after the election, Ray, we were friendly. You know, he came up and smiled and punched me in the arm, a little hard, and he said, on the Monday before Election Day, when I went out to my mailbox to get my mail and I found the application for next year's rebate check, I realized we really lost.
What else do you recall about how the decision came about to send rebate checks to property taxpayers rather than simply put a credit on their tax bill?
Well, first of all, our original proposal, as I recall mine, our group, was what we called a circuit breaker as opposed to a rebate. And the circuit breaker was tied to income and the percentage of one's income that goes to property taxes. And when your property tax payment exceeded a certain percentage of income, you'd get the difference from the state. I don't remember whether we proposed that circuit breaker be done as a check or a credit. Probably a credit would have been the more efficient way to do it. But in the legislative process that followed, it got converted into a homestead rebate, which was simpler for people to understand. I mean, the term was simpler, and the term was also used in other states. Other states had this. And the idea of a check going out was, my recollection was that it came out of the legislative people. But it didn't make much of a difference.
But in political terms, it makes a lot of difference.
It was politically very smart.
It was kind of a naked power grab, was it not?
Oh, I wouldn't say power grab. It was, you know, if we're going to go through all this trouble and get, you know, we'll take all the heat for raising the taxes and raising the income tax and all that, and we're going to give out this money, let's give it out in a check. And the governor, when we issued those checks, we had a card in the check, like you get when you get a refund from some credit card company or something, explaining why you got it. And that card was signed by Governor Byrne. And I was investigated for that.
What do you mean? Who investigated?
Somebody claimed an election connivance or something, and Bob Del Tufo defended me, and it was fine.
Uh-huh.
But they tried to make an issue of it.
Power grab is perhaps not the right phrase, but it's clearly a kind of electioneering. It's a use of government in the interest of electioneering, is it not?
Well, that's what the claim was, and you know, why Byrne's name was on it, not the tax division. You read it however you want.
Would a credit have saved the state money? Was it more expensive to send rebates?
It was probably more expensive to some extent. And then later we made it one check instead of two checks.
It was two checks initially?
Yeah.
Twice a year? Or?
Yeah, one before the primary and one before the election.
I think you're underscoring my point there.
Just giving you facts.
At this point in time, you are still, what, deputy treasurer? Or?
1976.
Okay. Give us an overview of the Department of Treasury at that time. How did it operate? How did it differ from how it operates now?
Okay. Well, before I do that, I just was reminded of an accomplishment of the Byrne administration that I'd forgotten about by reading in the paper yesterday that Senator Lautenberg and Senator Boxer were here talking about the Superfund, the federal Superfund, which I believe we created here. sometime, I forget which year it was, but there was an oil tanker on the Delaware River that capsized or sprung a big leak, and there was an ecological nightmare resulting. And the people, I guess DEP or somebody came to us. They needed money right away to put up buoys or do whatever you do. And now, first of all, we had no money. And second of all, we had no authority to spend money for something like this. So we had to scramble around, and we did figure out how to deal with it. But that led to the notion that we should, for future events like that, we should tax the oil companies and the chemical companies and set up a fund. And then if there was an oil spill again, we would have the money and the authority to deal with it. And we did do that. Now, the legislation got more complicated because DEP weighed in on it and added things, and particularly added cleaning up things that were already a problem, not things that might happen in the future, which was fine. It's their business. It bothered me a little bit because the likelihood to me was that they would use up the entire fund all the time, and we still wouldn't have money for an unforeseen event. But it passed that way, and we did use up the money. When some chemicals dump in Elizabeth exploded, there was a major incident.
Chemical Control Corporation.
Chemical Control Corporation. So but at least we had the money to deal with that.
This was called the Spill Compensation Fund?
Oil Spill Compensation Fund. And I believe that Jim Florio was the assemblyman who sponsored that bill, and then went to Washington as a congressman, and I believe he sponsored this bill, the Superfund, which is patterned after it. So anyway, I interrupt.
And do you think that happened in the first term?
Yeah, it was definitely in the first term. It might have been in the first year. I just don't remember. It would have been in '74, probably, first year. Anyway, going back to the Treasury Department, I wanted to talk about banking as a way of getting into that subject, because most state treasurers deal essentially with managing the state's bank accounts and investments, period. For New Jersey State Treasury, that was a relatively minor function, maybe 3 or 4 levels down in the bureaucracy. The state treasurer in New Jersey, in addition to that function, has the budget bureau, the controller, the tax division, the purchase and property, which is what other states have a Department of General Services Administration, the investment division. We had a division on pensions, managing the pensions. We had, which in other states is under a state controller. We had building and construction, and we had general oversight of all the authorities. And during our administration, we, by executive order, took over the local finance division out of Department of Community Affairs.
Why?
Because local government finance, which I mentioned in my last session, in the aftermath of New York, became a major threat to the state's credit. And the state treasury, at that time, we were taking all these steps to ensure that our local governments remain viable financially. And we needed a closer connection to that activity, and we arranged that. But going to so we had a gigantic operation, which in other states is maybe 4 or 5 different departments. And I believe that arrangement is highly beneficial to the state, and accounts for the fact that at least throughout all of our years, with the exception of a brief period when the income tax didn't pass, we were AAA rated by both Standard & Poor's and Moody's, and we were the only state in the East that was AAA rated, and I think one of 9 in the country, and including states like Utah, which had no debt at all, or a state like Virginia, which was AAA because it paid off its Confederate bonds when it didn't have to, and things like that. But it provides a coherence and a control over the government that worked very well. So anyway, but going back to the banking, you know, in '74, in those years, we had high inflation in the country and very high interest rates, particularly short-term interest rates, you know, 15–20%. And when we reviewed the banking arrangements that had evolved over time, we were not too happy with the way we were earning money on our deposits. So we began fixing that pretty early. Now, for example, the first question is, when you deposit a check, the state, when do you start earning money on it? What day? And we did a survey. You know, some banks it was the second day, some banks it was the third day, some banks it was. So we said it's the next day for everybody. So one bank came back and said, we can't do it in the next day. It has to be 2 days. So I said, take all the money out of that bank and put it in the other banks. And then I got the woman in charge of doing this came back and said, well, the president of that bank wants to meet with you. I said, it's too late. You know, we did, that's over. So then the next step was to bid all these bank accounts. Now, the bank accounts were sort of spread around all the banks, and there was a thing called compensating balances. A certain percentage of your money, the earnings on it, went to the bank to pay for the services they rendered. And at that point, when your money was earning 15%, that was an expensive way to do business. So we started bidding all the bank accounts. We would pay for this, we'd bid the service, we set the terms, and then we put the money where
was this your initiative?
Yes. We had some interesting stories out of that. One of them was we bid the unemployment insurance, which is a major account, managed over in the Labor Department. And a bank from Newark won the bid, and a few weeks afterward, the president called and said, you know, we won this bid, but nothing's happened. No one started shifting the account to us. So we sent over some people to Labor to find out what was going on. And what was going on was, it took like a month. What we found out was they had ordered a new batch of checks from the old bank during the time of the bid, which was a bureaucratic mistake. And it would have cost $90,000 of waste on those checks. But we were going to make $90,000 a month more interest. But instead of doing, you know, instead of eating the mistake, they want to cover up the mistake and use up the checks. Probably would have cost us $1 million. So those are the kinds of things you ran into. But we also changed the date on which vendors paid the sales tax. We made it the 20th of the month instead of the 30th. And we generally speaking, focused hard on moving the cash in and getting the most for it. That would have been the job of the state treasurer in most states. But we had a much bigger job.
Local government services moved back into the Department of Community Affairs,
Right.
probably in the 80s,
Yes.
I guess. But all the functions that you talked about, other than that, are still part of the purview of the state treasurer in New Jersey, are they not?
I think so. I think the difference, I'm not really expert in everything that's happened since I left, but I think the differences that I saw begin to happen after I left is, first of all, the succession of professional career officials was broken. That is, in all the time I was in government, it was Abe Vermeulen, Walt Wexler in the Budget Bureau, and then meanwhile they would scout the whole government for the best people in the finance divisions of other departments and bring over the best one, and then the succession for generation was lined up, and so it went to Ed Hofgesang and Dick Standiford and Rich Keevy, and Keevy stayed on a long time. But at some point that succession was broken, and people were brought in from the outside, and the natural next person was not hired for the job, and that was a negative to my way of thinking. In fact, early in the Byrne administration, I was offered the job of running the budget, the Division of Budget and Accounting, and I refused because it wasn't right. It wasn't.
Because you were new, and
well, I wasn't my place. It was their place. That's the way I looked at it, and it would have interfered with the career development pattern, and they were good people. So the second thing, and maybe more important, is that we dealt with the governor, Dick Leone, and then me. We did not.
The number 1 and 2 people in the Treasury dealt directly with the governor.
Right. Where we had obviously where there was legislation involved, we worked with the counsel's office, and where there were disputes between departments, someone from the governor's office might have mediated the dispute, although usually we just won the dispute ourselves and the governor backed us up. But we felt, at least we were in charge of our area. We weren't interfering in other people's area, but we were in charge of our area. I think over time the governor's office has grown much bigger and much more central to these things, and the budgets and the tax policies and all that are decided by committees outside of the Treasury, and the Treasurer's role is somewhat diminished. I don't know if that's good or bad. I wouldn't like it, but I think it confuses decision making, and I think, you know, looking back, you know, we were able to do things quickly and decisively. I remember one memo which I wish I'd still kept, where I wrote a 2-paragraph memo to Governor Byrne outlining a very complicated plan to refinance the Sports Authority bonds and use the savings to build the arena. And that required legislation, a voter referendum, and a very complex plan, but we summarized it in two paragraphs, and I got back the next day, okay, BTB. That's how it was done. That would never happen anymore.
Well, you were a young man at the time. You were in your 30s, right?
Yes.
But what was in your mind as to what you were trying to do? What was the goal?
Well, I don't think I thought of it that way. I mean, I had a job to do. I'd studied to be in government. So did Dick Leone. We were in the same school. And it was to do things right.
Good government was the goal.
Good government. And that was the governor's goal. So that worked fine.
In that vein, were there any reforms that you recall in the areas of purchasing or bond work, underwriting, and law firms? And that's
yeah, these are very important questions. First of all, in purchasing, Dick hired Earl Josephson to run the Division of Purchase and Property. Earl Josephson was a reporter, and a former State House reporter, and known for his great attention to detail, intricate detail. And we, of course, we wanted everything to be done correctly. There was never of any interference politically in any purchasing decision. The governor made it clear how he wanted things to run, and that's how we wanted things to run. At the beginning, one of the first problems we had when we came in, there was a lease of a building that had been worked out in the prior administration but had not yet been signed. And it was for this Human Services building, this white building. I forget where it is in Trenton anymore. but the terms had been settled with the developer, and we were supposed to just sign off on it. But I was assigned to look at it, and I met with those people. And we were getting tremendous pressure. The legislature actually passed a resolution encouraging us to sign this thing under these terms.
This developer had some clout.
Well, it was for the city's benefit, too. You know, it was a city project. But under the Cahill administration, there had been problems with state leases. And that was part of some scandal that they had. So we were pretty careful about it. And we negotiated with these people. It was very distasteful to me. First of all, I didn't know a lot about real estate at the time. The people were haughty. And I remember one of our secretaries was keeping minutes of these discussions, and they use the term force majeure, which is a term in real estate about major events happening outside of people's control, hurricane or something. And the guy spelled it out for the secretary. It's a French. He says it's a French term, and he spelled it. And I said, I think it's feminine and has an E at the end. I had no idea. But that's the kind of thing. But
did you renegotiate the lease?
In a couple of major ways. You found out that how you measure the space, whether it's the inside wall, the outside wall, how you measure the windows. We put in how we could get control of the building. When you rent a building like that, you're basically paying the entire debt service for it, and he gets to own the building at the end of the term, and you've paid for it. So we wanted a right to get control of the building, a purchase option, and the governor got involved and got us that. But the major thing I recall was they had a finder's fee in there of 10% to a local person. And so that was a lot of money. And I said, we don't pay finder's fees. We're easy to find. We're the one with the gold roof. And there was a lot of discussion about that. They said, well, we have a contract to pay this person, and if you don't pay us to us, we'll have to pay it to him. We can't afford it. And I said, well, it won't get upheld in a court of law. Anyway, we worked that out, so we would escrow the funds of the finder's fee until the litigation was over, and however the litigation went would determine where that escrow went. And I think it took 10 or 15 years that it finally went back to the state.
Some poor guy did some work for nothing.
Well, not as much work as he would have been compensated.
How about bond underwriting and legal work for the state?
Now, this is really important. We had a policy of rewarding merit in bond work. We did not know and did not care and who contributed what. And we felt, therefore, free to pick anyone we wanted for any assignment. If someone did well, they got to work again. If they didn't do well, they were thrown out and someone else was given a shot. And I'll give you an example. In 1977, Dave Beal, who was the third in the Treasury, a Harvard Law School graduate and my current partner, found in one of the bond documents from the Healthcare Authority that had sold bonds for the construction of the medical school based on the revenues of the medical school. Now, those revenues are in part revenues they would get from tuition, but essentially they're revenues they get from the state of New Jersey. And we were paying, I think it was like 9%. I'm not giving you exact numbers, but a high percentage because the bonds were low-rated revenue bonds. And Dave found in this bond covenant that there was a special basis for refunding those bonds at par. Usually when you refund bonds, you pay a premium to the bondholders for the right to refund them, and you have to wait 10 years to refund them. But there was a special refunding if they were refunded with state general obligation bonds. And so we proposed to the governor that we do a refunding of those bonds with a state bond issue. That meant, again, legislation, a referendum, and then, if the voters approved of it, the refunding. And this was an election year, and you know, we didn't even think of it in those terms. I mean, to have a question on the ballot in an election year is usually politically fraught with. But it was fine, do it, it's a good idea. So we did do it, and we passed it. Now, for that whole year, I think it was Goldman Sachs did all the work on that bond issue, all the calculations for us, for no fee. And this was going to be a state bond issue, which would be competitively bid. So there's no underwriting fee for them in that deal. But they did that as a service to the state of New Jersey, to be on our good side, basically. And that transaction was consummated. It was a fantastic savings. I forget the numbers, but if there was $100 million of bonds between the reserve funds and the savings that we got, we might have wound up with $50 million extra cash, which we gave to the medical school in Newark and New Brunswick for building of theirs. Now, when the next opening came up on the Healthcare Facilities Authority, I wanted Goldman Sachs to get that job. And I enforced that in a dispute with the board of that agency. Now, if it was in current day, this would have looked fishy, you know, that the governor's office in Trenton is pushing a particular underwriter. It would have been like some kind of political payoff. But because in our day there was no such thing, and everyone knew that, and we knew it, so we could do it, and we did do it. And what we did that way was get from these underwriting companies and from the bond councils a tremendous amount of free service for the state in all sorts of ways. Now, today, everything is very ethical, but that ethical standard is met by procedures, by competitive bidding and RFPs and all kinds of paper transactions to be able to assure some investigator later or some newspaper person that all these contracts have been handed out in the most ethical, competitive manner. And that's good, but it's not as good as the way we did it.
Which was just what?
Because you couldn't give Goldman Sachs the next job. You'd have to bid the next job. And you couldn't get them to do what they did for us, because they couldn't count on you to give them credit for what they did. So I think we had a pretty good system. Now we had in bond counsel work. At that time, the treasurer decided who the bond counsel was. Now it's the Attorney General's office. And we had the three major national bond counsel companies doing our work for us. There was a development during those years of New Jersey bond counsel firms, which didn't really exist before. And there was pressure to give that business to New Jersey bond counsel firms, which we resisted for the whole term of both terms. We did let them do EDA work, which work was really basically, a company would come in and get a loan from its bank, and then it would use EDA to turn that into a tax-exempt loan by EDA's issuing it, but it was basically a bank loan, and the bond counsel would be hired by the company or the bank, and it was fine with us if it suited the company or the bank to have a New Jersey counsel, but we used only national.
Why?
Because they were the best.
Let me just get his tie off of the microphone. Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
I'll give you an example of that. At one point, the Garden State racetrack in Cherry Hill burned down. And as treasurer is a member of the Sports Authority, and people came to the Sports Authority to rebuild the Garden State racetrack. We did a study of it at the Sports Authority, and a feasibility study, and determined that it was not feasible either as a public racetrack or as a private racetrack. We did it both ways. The treasurer is also on EDA, and some private person came to EDA wanting to rebuild Garden State racetrack. Not Brennan. This was before that. And he came with a bond counsel from a different state. And I said to the bond counsel, you're showing me a feasibility study that says that this could work, but I have in my possession a feasibility study that I commissioned that says it can't work. How do I allow a state agency to sell bonds for this project when I believe it won't work? And his answer was, well, you're not exposed because it's not state money and it's only a state agency, and everyone knows that the bondholders know that they're not going to get their money unless the project works. And I said, yeah, but it has our name on it. So anyway, I excused myself and I called one of the New York bond counsels that I depended on, and he just sort of laughed. So I went back and said, we're not doing it. But you needed quick answers from the best people, because we're a big business in New Jersey. We're a big issuer, a big financial power, and you want big, top-notch lawyers. So that's the way we did it.
You were talking about Goldman Sachs. I couldn't help but think that, ironically, John Corzine may have been a young bond trader at Goldman Sachs back then when they were doing that good work for New Jersey.
Might have been, but this was the municipal finance department. I never knew John Corzine.
When you were talking about the various functions that the state treasurer oversaw back then, you said controller. Was there a state controller? And what do you think of the current proposal to create a real state controller bureaucracy and function?
Well, there is a state controller under the statutes, and there always has been, but it's not the same meaning as the proposed new state controller. It's just controlling the funds, and there's an internal audit and all that, but it's not an investigative supervisory thing. Now we have a state auditor, and we have a state inspector general, and we have all this. I don't have a particular opinion. I think if they have a state controller who's going to add yet another level of oversight to give confidence to the taxpayers, and that the state's problems are being fixed. Fine. I think the issue there was whether it would be elected or appointed. Elected would give a different, stronger view of it, but I have no great opinion one way or the other.
You also were talking about that building lease for human services. Did Brendan Byrne also direct that state offices be built in Trenton?
Yes, and I'm glad you raised that again, because it became actually a major project. From that one experience with dealing with a private developer, we were finished doing that. The next building we needed to build was the Justice Complex. And we built that, instead of leasing it from a private person who would own it at the end, we leased it from the Mercer County Improvement Authority and ran the whole project. But they issued the bonds which were secured by our lease, and we owned it at the end. And it was tax exempt and so forth. We had major overruns on the construction of the building because it was in 1978 at the height of the oil crisis, and you couldn't get aluminum, and we had to go to Japan to get the aluminum. I mean, physically go to Japan to negotiate to get the aluminum. It was a tremendous problem, but nevertheless, the rent per square foot was the best deal the state ever got, despite the overruns, and the state owns the building. Then our thinking went to why should we have rented from the Mercer County Improvement Authority? We'll create our own authority, and we'll rent it from ourselves. So we proposed this New Jersey State Building Authority to build these buildings. And we did it quite carefully. We put limits on how much we could issue, and each project had to be specifically approved by the legislature. And we talked it over with the rating agencies before we did it, and it flew in the face of standing New Jersey law that over the bonding of this kind of project. But our bond counsel told us that subsequent Supreme Court decisions would have reversed the standing law on the subject, and if we were challenged, we would prevail. And on that basis, we went forward and issued the bond. Well, we went forward and planned 3 buildings in Trenton: the DP building, the Community Affairs building, and there's a building on State Street. Various state offices are in it. We had some difficulty with the city over that, which is a separate fun story. But this all happened at the end of the second term. And in the fall, well, I'll go into the story, because in the summer we were going to do this. And Mayor Holland came to us and said he preferred, instead of 3 separate sites scattered as these buildings are today, he preferred they be massed in one location. Now, we had talked to the city planning people before we chose the sites that were their sites, and we were far along in our thinking by that time, and didn't like the idea of starting from scratch. We had already got the Department of Transportation to help us with the land acquisition and so forth. But we went through this thing, and there was a big, Holland set up some kind of local corporation planning entity to look at all this, and they hired some major architects to advance this massed development concept. Rouse Company, maybe, I forget which one, I shouldn't say. And this all culminated, well, I said to Holland at one point when I was very frustrated about it, I said, look, you do it, carry on as much as you want about all this, but on September 15th we're going forward with our plan, because that's the only time we have left. But I went to a meeting downtown in Trenton with lots of these business people, and this architect presented this master plan they had, and it was called the New Trenton Corporation. And one of the pictures they draw, these renderings, showed this office building, and there was this very elegant woman walking. She had these two Borzoi dogs on a leash, in front of the building, and there was a Rolls Royce coming around the corner. It was like a great picture. And they all made their speeches, and then I was supposed to speak, and I got up and I said, I really enjoyed listening to all that, and especially the picture of the Etzel. And then I sat down. That was it. And then they voted to go with my plan. Anyway, we built, though we had to build those buildings and get the bonds out before we left office, we felt. And sometime in the fall, the landlords who would lose our tenancy sued. And this became a major case in New Jersey, Enurato versus whoever, maybe me. But we went to the Superior Court and got it decided in one day in our favor. But we needed the time to, if he was going to appeal, he could wait 45 days and then appeal. And we didn't have 45 days. So we appealed the decision. That was in our favor. And we went to the appellate division. I don't want to say the wrong thing, but maybe the same week, maybe the following week, at a hearing that was held at the Trenton Country Club over dinner, and we won that appeal right then.
The appellate hearing was heard at the Trenton Country Club over dinner?
Something like that. I'm making up. I'm elaborating a little bit, but it was an
informal.
It was an informal, and we got a decision. And I think the court system was, there was an issue of abuse of process involved here on the part of the, they were using the court system really just to kill some idea for business reasons, not because there was a real, but anyway, whatever it was. The Supreme Court took its reasonable time. Everyone knew it was going to the Supreme Court anyway, so the idea was, let's clear these first few steps, get right to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court heard it and ruled in our favor. And I think it was in January, 2 weeks before we left office, we sold the bonds and set up that project.
Now, was the Justice Complex part of that?
No, the Justice Complex was before that. This was DEP, Community Affairs.
And the building on State Street.
And the building on State Street.
There was controversy about the quality of the construction of the Justice Complex at various points in time. I think some pieces of that aluminum you got were falling off, and there were complaints about the heating and the ventilation. Are you familiar with any of that?
No.
Okay.
I know there were complaints about the cost overruns, and I mean, I'm not qualified to go back. I think architecturally, choosing aluminum at that time of the economy might not have been the greatest idea, and there was something wrong about the lie of some beam or something. But I mean, the building's still there. It was built in 1978.
And it's probably the most distinctive building in
government. I had fun with that building. We had a requirement to do public art when you build a building. And we set aside a certain, whatever the percentage was for public art. And we had a panel.
Was this a state or a federal requirement back in those days? State requirement.
Yeah. We had a panel of art people, separate from us, that we named to spend that money and choose the art. and they did whatever they did. It was their call. At the end, there was something like $90,000 left, maybe out of $1 million, out of a big number. And they wanted to spend that $90,000 on a George Segal sculpture. Now, George Segal is world famous sculptor, and we eventually
From New Jersey.
From New Jersey, and we eventually did use one of his sculptures on the building on State Street. But we couldn't get a sculpture of his for $90,000 at the Justice Complex. So Len DiDonato, who was the head of buildings and construction, came with Johnson, Seward Johnson, who is now a more famous sculptor than he was then, but he was making these lifelike bronze figures. And Len said, well, for $90,000, I can get 12. And anyway, he did get those sculptures from Seward Johnson, which I think are quite good. But anyway, at the time there was a great dispute, public dispute, because the art community didn't feature Seward Johnson as a real sculptor, and they had public disagreements between Len and these art people in the press. Anyway, Len carried that public dispute. He said, look, I'm Italian, I have art in my blood, and workmen like this, whatever. But when we opened the building, we had a ceremony in the building, and I saw the artwork in the building, which was this gigantic screwdriver out of, that kind of steel that turns brown. That in the atrium of the building, this like 4-story high screwdriver, that was the real artwork. Maybe Len was right.
I think everybody thinks, or most people think, that those Seward Johnson sculptures have worn well over the years. Sculptures of lawyers and judges in action.
Right.
Yeah.
And then when we did the one on State Street, we had George Segal, who I know personally, a friend of my wife, and not then but since, and he's a wonderful person, a great sculptor. And it was a sculpture of construction workers on a scaffold. That's right.
That's the Roebling building,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
But when we looked at it, there was a ladder leading up to the scaffold from the ground. And we said, no. This isn't an artistic thing, but we can't have any ladder going up to the sculpture. So they changed the sculpture, the sculpture for safety's sake.
The Capital Budgeting and Planning Commission was also created around this time to review state government bond proposals, and it was chaired initially by former Governor Cahill. Was it effective?
Yeah, it was very effective. The first bond issue under the Byrne administration was a transportation bond issue, as I recall, and it was voted down, causing a real problem for running out of transportation funds. So that was the impetus for creating this Capital Planning Commission. And the voters were quite discerning. It was like somehow they could tell that the planning of that bond issue wasn't that good. That's the way I looked at it. I don't remember Cahill dealing with Cahill on it, but I remember Bruce Coe being the staff director of it, and they did a very good job. They brought in all the cabinet officers who wanted to have capital funds, and they reviewed them seriously. And I remember that in our time, the Capital Planning Commission approved 21 state bond issues, of which I voted for 20. And the public approved those 20. and not the one I voted against. So it reaffirmed my
You're
belief
very
in the
very in touch with the people.
Well, I thought that was discerning of, but it created a good system for reviewing capital needs.
And that was an independent, freestanding commission? It was not.
It was a freestanding, but it had state, some state officials. I was on it.
You mentioned the creation of the state EDA and bond guarantees. Byrne served during the worst economy, worst New Jersey economy since the Depression. Can state government really do anything significant to spur the economy, or is it simply PR spin?
Well, yeah, it can do something, but I think it can't do as much as people think it can do or like to say it can do. But it's important. It's not an insignificant role. The EDA was going around. That idea was in other states by then. We created it in New Jersey, and the principal purpose of it at the time was to within the federal tax law to convert certain kinds of private financings of private businesses into tax-exempt financing. And the idea was, if it wasn't for this tax-exempt financing, this business couldn't succeed at what it was doing. It would move to another state or something like that. Now, it became an indiscriminate use of tax-exempt financing. And because the cost of giving the tax-exempt financing existed, but no one could see it. And it wasn't our cost in the state of New Jersey. It was the federal government's cost. It was someone else's cost. But we quickly got into a disagreement with EDA over this indiscriminate use of the method. And they were giving out tax-exempt financings for fast food outlets, for skateboard park, bar and grill, things that weren't going to leave New Jersey anyway. And that came to a head at one meeting where I think almost the entire agenda was full of this kind of thing.
Who ran the EDA in those days?
It was Bob Powell. And we objected.
Did he go to the Woodrow Wilson School
Yes,
with you and Dick Leone?
After us.
After you. Go ahead.
But, I mean, he was the administrator. The board, I forget who was the board members.
You sat on the board, or the treasurer sat on the board?
The treasurer sat on the board, but this was one that I had an assigned person to go. There's so many authorities that I couldn't go to all of them. We had several different people just to go to authorities. But it came to a head at one meeting where the agenda was ridiculous, full of these things, and my representative argued against all of them and voted against all of them and was outvoted 8-1 on all of them. And before those people left that room, I had the minutes vetoed.
By the governor?
By the governor.
Before they left the room?
Before I left the room.
How was he communicating to you in the
She
day
called
before
me,
email?
says, I lost it 8-1, and we went down there and got it vetoed.
Now,
It's vetoed. I don't know if he actually physically wrote up the thing.
Why would these 8 other people think that the creation of these small businesses was a good thing, and you would disagree with that?
Well, it wasn't the creation of them. It was they were going to be created anyway. There was going to be a McDonald's, on Route 1 or wherever. Anyway, it's just that they were going to pay more interest for their bank loan. And anyway, what happened soon after that was 60 Minutes did an expose of this nationally. And that in turn led to a federal crackdown on the use of tax-exempt bonds, which was correct, except it went so far that it made life much more difficult for us in the normal use of tax-exempt bonds for projects. So there was a consequence to it, and we couldn't have undone the national picture that led to this. But if others had done what we were trying to do, maybe it wouldn't have happened. But you know, the idea that McDonald's needed tax-exempt financing, when 60 Minutes showed it, didn't carry the day.
So you and 60 Minutes were on the same
was.
side of that issue.
Right.
The larger question of whether a governor and his policies can truly stimulate economic activity within a state, within this state, what's your view?
Well, I think it can. I think the Sports Authority, certainly the Meadowlands Commission that I was head of first, and then the Sports Authority in the Meadowlands stimulated billions of dollars worth of development, because once the Meadowlands Commission set the rules, people could invest money knowing that they were going to have a garbage dump open up next to them and it would get cleaned up. And when the Sports Authority set up the stadium and the racetrack there, it proved that point, and it made this whole area much more desirable. I think you know, all that the state does with roads and rails and ports, all those kind of infrastructure, obviously make it accommodating to development, and also supporting higher education and high school education. All of those things lead to a good economy. The specific subsidy programs, I'm a little more skeptical of, you know, where you give money to private businesses to encourage them, where you give back the income, the BEAT programs and all that. I'm a little bit on the side of the skeptics on the value of those kinds of things, where, you know, a company comes in and somehow they finagle so that the state pays all their sales tax when they buy typewriters and computers, and all that troubles me.
Let's tackle one more subject before we take a break, and that's the preparation of the state budget. How did you develop a budget during the Byrne years?
Well, it was first of all, we relied tremendously on the Budget Bureau. We were not, neither Dick nor I was like for Dick watching the budget process. We weren't like micromanagers. We let the Budget Bureau do its work. They were hugely competent. And then on the major issues that existed, we would weigh in at that point. Now, in our years, the major issues were, in 1974 and 5 and 6, how do you put together a budget with this overhang of the school finance reform package and the income tax? And you know, do you put the income tax in the budget and then take it out, or do you put in the new school funding formula in the budget or not? I don't remember the details, but those were the kinds of issues that we had to face, and we also related to the governor on the budget in the same way. There were general things discussed. The governor was also not a micromanager, and his staff didn't get in our way, and if they tried to, we wouldn't let them. Just for efficiency's sake, you know, not to have make this a party, you know, it was a serious business, and we summarized for the governor the issues that required his decision as we saw it. We were always conservative. There were never issues of let's blow up the revenue estimates to get by, or everything was always on the up and up. One year, for example, with inflation going on, we had to cut back the cost of living adjustment to pensioners, which we could do because it wasn't an entitlement at that point. And we said we want to do this. That's a big issue. It affects the labor force. The governor said, if you have to do it, do it. And we did it. So I left off. But go ahead. I wanted to say something else about that banking stuff.
We'll get to it in 1 second. Just to follow on this, certainly in the last 15 years, getting the budget passed is sort of the dominant political drama annually in Trenton. Was it in those days?
No, the only drama was over the tax, the income tax. The budget was, first of all, it was well understood by both parties in the legislature that the budget was the budget, and it was prepared by Walt Wexler, basically. You know, it was something they could rely on. It was honest. There weren't gimmicks in it. There weren't tricks. They weren't going to get blindsided by something. And so the budget committee would meet. Afterward, people would go to Lorenzo's, both parties. You know, the people were sociable, friendly. Everyone knew what was happening, and we never had any major problems on the budget. The budget deteriorated afterward. I don't want to get into a whole history, which I know, but after the Byrne administration, sometime after, it began to deteriorate both in the quality of what was in it, the intellectual basis of it, and the financial basis of it, and it became more of a game.
In the Kane years or in the Florio years?
The end of the Kane years.
End of the Kane years.
Yeah.
You wanted to make another point about banking?
Yeah, and it also relates to your purchase question. You know, I was talking about all the procedures we had to go through to get the tax up and the rebate and all the equipment and all the mechanics to make that work. In the middle of that, one of the banks came in and said, we want to do this privatized. We want to do a lockbox. We'll collect the tax for you. It'd be easier for private enterprise. And the governor asked me to look at it. And I didn't like the idea, but I couldn't say to him honestly that I was certain that they weren't right.
Why did you instinctively not like the idea?
Well, it's your tax information. I don't want a private bank to know. It might not have even been legal, but I don't believe. I am a firm believer in the quality of the bureaucracy to handle things like that, especially our bureaucracy in the tax division. And I say that because I tested the waters about it. I would talk to people. People had a small business, a diner. You know, have the tax division people been here? Yeah, they ordered us last year. How were they? Oh, they were very polite. You know, you found out how people are. But anyway, we actually conducted a bid between the banks and the tax division as to who was going to administer the income tax. And the tax division won.
The legislature also created an Office of Fiscal Affairs.
Right.
How did you relate to it and its head at one time, Sam Alito Sr.?
I remember Sam Alito from the Hughes days, but not from the Byrne days. The Byrne days, there was a guy named Bragg, I think, who was running that. And I related to them negatively at the time, until they changed the leadership of it, and then I related to them positively.
You just didn't get along with Mr. Bragg.
No, and I didn't think they were honest. And the major issue of contention was they advocated in 1 year that we could skip a pension contribution to the pension funds. And that was not their job. I mean, that was not an honest financial overseer's position. It was a political position. And our position was the honest position, that despite the problems we were having, we were not going to skip a pension appropriation. So because of that, I had no respect for them, for that position, not for the individual people there. I think they do a good job.
Let's stay in the first term a little while longer. Two things I want to talk about before we get to Dick Leon's leaving. One is your interaction with state authorities. What was it? How did you find them? What do you think of that relationship between state government and its independent authorities?
Well, there are two categories. One is the authorities on which the state treasurer is a member and a voting member. Sports authority, educational facilities, EDA, a variety of those. And then there are authorities like the Turnpike, which at that time at least the state treasurer was not a member. And the relationship was obviously closer where you were a member. And you had to find out. Now, I gave you a story from EDA. The sports authority was the most important authority in those years because it was new. And I had not, as deputy treasurer, had not been working on the sports authority matters, but when I became treasurer, I did. And I mentioned before this financing technique that we used on the Healthcare Facilities Authority for the medical school bonds. In the following year, in 1978, we came up with the same idea for the Sports Authority. The Sports Authority had been financed in 1974 with moral obligation bonds. That's a kind of bond where it's based on the revenues of the Sports Authority, but if something goes wrong, the state is morally, though not legally, obligated to pay the debt service. In effect, the state is practically obligated to pay the debt service. And those bonds were at 7.5% because they're deemed to be risky. But we had the same idea. We'll sell state general obligation, voter-approved bonds, pay off those old bonds, and save money, and we did. And we eventually sold those bonds for roughly 5%. So, and the idea was we would save enough money to build the arena for free, which would have worked, except in the same 1978 time frame with costs going up, the arena cost went up, and we only got it half free. the other half we had to pay for. But because of that project, you know, I was at the Sports Authority, and I was the chairman of the Finance Committee, and I went there, and I actually played a major role, not just at a monthly meeting, but day to day. And I negotiated the lease agreement with the Nets for the arena, which was arduous, but it worked out. And
why was it arduous?
Well, the Nets were represented at least by a fellow named Cohn, who was a high executive at Madison Square Garden, and later owned the Boston Celtics, and a very competent, you know, tough, knowledgeable, experienced guy. And I just felt insecure trying to negotiate against someone of that stature in a field I knew very little about. And in any case, it went on for a long time. They claimed they needed all kinds of concessions and so forth and so on. And we had this negotiation which ended in an all-night telephone call with him screaming at me because he had a toothache and he had to go to the dentist at 7 o'clock. And it was 4 in the morning. And I figured by then that's about it. So we made that deal. Now, that was in 1978. And I never knew whether it was a good deal or not, because I just didn't know enough. But in 1991, we were negotiating, I was a consultant then, for the 76ers to move to Camden. And because of that, I had dinner with the owner of the 76ers, and he said something to the effect, but boy, you guys screwed the Nets. They have the worst lease in the league. So I felt vindicated. But the authorities, have issues. At that time, there wasn't an authorities unit watching all the authorities. The authorities had issues that came and went that required the state to be involved or not involved. The counsel's office was involved because they had to approve minutes of meetings for the governor. So there was an informal arrangement where they or we would attend a meeting if necessary. We would consult with each other, so that there wasn't a major operation going. And for the most part, those authorities worked all right, I think. There were many issues with the New York Port Authority, bus purchases, and whether or not they could pay for rail extensions, and their bonds prevented it, and toll increases. And
you didn't feel from the vantage point of Treasury, however, that the authorities were competitive power centers or areas of mischief in state government?
Well, I gave you a few examples where I thought EDA, for example, wasn't behaving well. But no, I didn't. I don't remember any instances of mischief.
Today, it's thought that if there is corruption in state government, it probably percolates first in the authorities because there's somehow less oversight there.
I don't know how to comment on that. I mean, the treasurer and when we were in office, the Attorney General were members of the Sports Authority. If the treasurer is on the Sports Authority and is voting and getting all the documents and approving everything, I don't know why that would be true. There are authorities, as I say, like the Turnpike, where, but even then you have the Transportation Commissioner. So I can't speak for what's going on today.
When did Dick Leone leave?
I think it was August of 1976.
August of 76. Right around the same time that the income tax was passed.
Right after.
Right after. He got that done and he left.
Right.
Before we get to his departure, just how did you and he and the governor get that tax passed?
Well, first of all, I had very little to do with the legislature and the politics of those issues. That was Dick and the counsel's office and the governor's office. My role in all that was, checking on counter proposals for their validity and keeping tabs on what was going on and how a new idea would fit into the budget and that kind of thing. But and occasionally I did I guess, with legislators or went to committees and whatever. But I was not a major player in the passage of the income tax. But of course, when the court shut down the schools in July of 1976. That's what prompted the passage of the income tax.
Was that a huge victory? Was there celebrating in the governor's office when the tax finally passed after 3 years of trying to get it passed?
I don't remember that kind of thing. My thought, I guess my thinking would have been sooner or later this is going to pass because it's necessary and just a matter of people getting used to the idea. I felt that the fear, political fear about it was based on mythology, and that people were so afraid, and I just didn't see that that the public would object that much.
Were you borne out by
yes.
the facts?
No, because and you know the thing worked. The property tax did go down, not even counting the rebate, and it went down at a time when inflation was 12%, and it stayed down for a couple of years. Now I read today that the Byrne program was a failure because since it was passed, property taxes have gone up, but that's like a nitwit talking. This is 30 years ago. Lots of things happened in the meantime, but the vindication of it, of course, was the governor got reelected by a landslide.
But first, his popularity plummeted.
His popularity plummeted because this went on for so long. He stuck to his position. You know, the Democrats didn't like him, the Republicans didn't like him, and everyone made a big deal about this tax. But once I remember in September, I think, of '76, the Sports Authority opened, and there was this big ceremony, and we all went there, and they had some kind of hokey stagecoach that we all were on, and it went around the track, and it's just stupid, you know. But after that, you know, our party, the governor and his wife, and a lot of cabinet officers, and Sonny Werblin and all, were walking back through the grandstand to where we were having dinner or whatever, and the people were screaming and cursing and red-faced, and you know, like they were going to kill us. Really violent-looking people, and we had state troopers. But all of a sudden, I found myself standing with the governor alone, and the rest of the party with the state troopers were, you know, a few yards behind. And it looked to me like if one person in that mob got the nerve to do something, throw a punch or something, that the whole mob would have joined in. I was very afraid of that. And there was that kind of venomous attitude about all this, which I could not understand. I just don't believe that those people would have noticed the difference in their economic livelihood from a 2% income tax at the state level, and they didn't in the end.
In the end. But right then, did you think he could recover politically, or did you think he was dead?
I think he could recover.
You did?
Yeah. But I was not a political savant. You know, no one asked my opinion, and I wouldn't offer it because I wasn't in that field.
So you didn't make any recommendations for how to handle this in any public relations way?
No, I really believe that once this was carried out, if it was carried out well and efficiently, and once the tax bills came at the local level, and once the withholding started, and once the rebate checks went out, that it would, all this heat would dissolve, that it would go away because it was almost immaterial to the average person. And for the wealthy, you know, we had a 2.5% income tax at the top end, which is deductible from your federal income tax. So it was like, what's the difference, you know? And I think that's the way people regarded it. Plus, I do think that the honesty of the administration, you know, the record of integrity played into this in an important way, because I feel that if there'd been a scandal or something, and people thought that they put a tax on us and they stole the money, that kind of claim could have really hurt.
The first time that the public paid this new state income tax was April of 77?
Well, there was withholding in September of 76.
Okay, so that's why the anger from these people at the
first,
Meadowlands.
yeah, the Meadowlands ceremony was on the first day of withholding.
Did you think at the time that Byrne would even run for re-election?
I had no idea.
Did you care?
Yeah, I did care because I admired him a great deal, his stoicism in the face of all this, and his willingness to stick to the right position. And I thought it would be wonderful if he were rewarded for that. You know, and he did. It was wonderful.
Okay. Did you know that Leon was planning to leave as soon as the income tax was?
I did not.
Do you recall how you found out, or
No.
anything about the announcement?
No. I was talking to Dave Deal last night. I said, they're going to ask me this question. Do you remember? I said, no. We were really busy. You know, we really worked hard and a lot of hours and didn't have time for chatting and things like that.
Were you the obvious successor to Leon?
I guess.
You were the deputy treasurer?
I was the deputy, yeah.
So when he left, did he leave right away? He left in August, you said?
Yeah, in August.
You became acting treasurer? Or
Acting treasurer.
Acting treasurer. How did you feel about that?
It felt good, you know. I felt that I deserved that shot and could do it, and I enjoyed it. The first day, I asked the secretaries to give me all the mail that was addressed to the treasurer that you normally wouldn't see. You know, it would get routed out to different people before it ever. And they wheeled it in on a big wagon thing. And on top was a letter from a woman attached to a huge fat file. And the letter was that she had been sideswiped by a state car a year ago, somewhere in North Jersey. And they had tracked the car down to the motor pool in Trenton. This local police had. She had the license number. And what she wanted was $300 for the damage. And for a year, this correspondence had been building up where the state refused to give it to her. And there were letters to the insurance company and this and that. So before the morning first staff meeting, I called in the division director who had the motor pool, and I said, what is this? You know, what's going on here? What do you think happened? And he said, well, probably some unauthorized person took out a state car and then hit the woman and came back and didn't want to be in trouble. So I said, well, did you report it to the state police? No. I said, well, do that. And then I said, get the woman a check today. You know, I mean, why we've spent $10,000 turning down this $300 check, and everyone, you agree that she's entitled to it. Give her the money. So then we went into the staff meeting, and I took that motor pool out of his division and put it in a different division in the staff meeting. I said, look, when someone writes to me, you assume that that person is my mother. You know, how you want that person treated, how I want that person treated. So I enjoyed this. I like to put that kind of personal character on things, and I liked it.
Did you look at all the mail the second day?
No. I went through a lot of it. I got a pretty good understanding of things. I also, the person who had been the press secretary or press, whatever you call it, left too. And I didn't replace that. And I
You didn't need a public information officer?
No, I didn't want one. And my secretary, who was fantastic, you know, the press would call her. All the division directors were told, if any press calls you, give them whatever facts they want. Don't give them any opinions or, you know, what you think of the policy or this or that. But if they want to know how much sales tax was collected or, you know, whatever, tell them. And she handled those phone calls, and if they need to talk to me, I talked to them. But we didn't have a... And then in those days, the press office was in the State House. All the press had offices back in the back on the first floor. And at night, after I finished work, I would walk down, hang around. Someone had a question they could ask me. But I didn't have a press officer.
How did you regard the press?
Good. My friend, you know, my poker game is made up of the press people.
At that time or today?
Yeah, at that time.
Okay.
And I was friends. That was my social circle and my friends.
Did you get good press as a result?
I never got press. I got one story. You know, we had this energy crisis at the time. You know, for all those years with the gasoline prices high, and so I said we're going to get Chevettes for the state cars. You know, and get rid of all these bigger cars. And I got a Chevette for myself. So the other departments would complain to the motor pool people. You know, we can't drive around in a Chevette. And then they would say, as they were told, the state treasurer has one. Call him and complain about what you're getting. You know, so, but this somehow made the newspaper, not through me, but they wrote a column about it. But I was not in the newspaper.
When you succeeded Leon, did you have any special personal goals?
No.
You just wanted to continue what you and he had been doing?
Just keep working, yeah. I mean, we had there wasn't time to be thinking too much about personal goals. We had this income tax to do. We had the Sports Authority project to get going. We had the refunding of the bonds for the medical school. We had the cities to save and the housing and finance. I mean, it was just a tremendous amount of work.
Was it in hindsight, was it a wonderful time?
Yes, it was.
In what sense?
Well, you were doing important things. They were working out for the most part. You were in a good work environment. You didn't have to worry about, you know, being asked to do something you wouldn't do, you didn't want to do, and facing moral dilemmas and all that kind of thing. It was just, people were nice. Got along. I mean, I had issues with all the cabinet officers, you know, conflicts, but always nice. At the end, on this motor pool issue, we sent out a directive that everyone had to get their car serviced at such and such mileages, because you got better gas mileage if you did that. And DEP wasn't doing it. They weren't bringing their cars in. And Jerry English was the commissioner. When I knew Jerry, got along well. But I had a group come from the motor pool and take all the cars right out of their parking lot. And people coming out of work and going to get their car, and some guy in a jumpsuit would get ahead of them, take the car and leave. That's the way we did stuff. And then we had a cabinet meeting, but I got along fine with Jerry, it wasn't a problem. There was a cabinet meeting where Phil Lampe, who was agriculture secretary, started, well, Governor, you know, I went to get gas on last Saturday, and these guys in Treasury, you know, my state credit card wasn't any good, and I was embarrassed. And we had real trouble getting a gasoline contract in that year. You know, it was hard to do, and we got one, but we got it late. And the governor says, "What do you think about that, Cliff?" And I said, "Well, I'm curious what he's doing driving around in a state car on a Saturday. And he got all huffy. Well, I was making a speech. It was official business. And I said, well, Phil, you have a chauffeur. And, you know, if you went on Friday knowing that you had a speech on Saturday to get your car filled at the motor pool, you could have got it at half price. And the governor said, Phil, you're going to lose this one. But we...
So you were a hard ass when it came to dollars and cents. You were a pinch penny.
I was, and because I didn't want to be wasting time on stuff. And also it wasn't. Here's another one. When David Bardeen was commissioner of DEP, I got a call from a woman in Bergen County, and I took these calls, you know. And she was in a historical commission, and they had bought a historical house with their money. They took a loan and bought this house in consultation with DEP to preserve this historical house. And then they would get Green Acres money from DEP at some point to pay back their loan, and they hadn't gotten it. And she was calling to say, you know, we called DEP, you know, we don't have enough money to pay the interest on this loan. It's gone off much longer than we thought. And DEP says that the Treasury Department is slow in holding up our check. So I said, well, I'll get it for you, you know, and I called the accounting division, and they told me that the paperwork hadn't even come over from DEP to launch this check. It wasn't us, you know. But I felt so bad for this lady, you know, who was trying to do something useful, and getting this kind of not only bad treatment, but lies. So I called DEP, and I said, I want the paperwork, you know, in my office so I can give this lady the check today. And the lady said, well, you know, Commissioner Bardeen is in Washington, so he won't be able to sign this paperwork today. I said, well, there are trains to Washington. Get on one and get that thing back to me today, which they did. So it wasn't pinching pennies, because we wasted the train fare to Washington and back. But, you know, this is what we would do.
I was struck by your saying, treat that woman as if she were my mother. Is that a good philosophy of government?
Yeah, I mean, this woman was important. This woman, I mean, she was doing something in reliance on the state government. The state government are people, you know, not some bureaucracy of nameless people. It's me, and the governor, and people. So, I mean, you can't always satisfy everyone's, but you shouldn't. You just, by neglect, cause people problems.
You served as acting treasurer until the governor decided to drop acting from your title and make you the state treasurer. How did that happen?
Well, I don't know how that decision was made, but on one day in January of '77, the governor called me and said, you want to be treasurer? And I said, yeah, sure. And he said, well, I'm going to name you in the State of the State message today, this morning, or whatever. So that was how it happened. I called my wife, and she was playing tennis. She came over, she sat in the balcony, and then in his speech he announced that he was going to make me treasurer, which was terrific, you know. And there was a standing ovation from me, from the legislators, which surprised me, but it made me feel real good, because I was not a public person, and I didn't realize that people knew who I was, basically. But I thought the acceptance was genuine, and I appreciated it, and I appreciated the governor did that.
Why do you think it took him 4 or 5 months to get around to elevating you?
I don't know.
I think he wanted to see how you would do.
You could ask him. I have no idea.
So this was the re-election year. You became state treasurer
That's right.
in the re-election year.
Right.
The treasurer works so closely with the governor that you were ineluctably dragged into politics that year, were you not?
Not really. There were only a couple of things that I did in my recollection that had to do with the election. One that people don't know about was that there was a story. They were trying to set up a story that the state, once we got through the election in '77, would have to raise the taxes to balance the following year's budget. That would have been a damaging story. So one of the reporters came to see me. It was Harvey Fisher.
Bergen Record at the time?
Bergen Record and State House. And he said, you know, I got this, you know, whatever source he had, there are people all over the state who could make projections and things. And I got this story, and what's your view of it? And I said, I have the budget figured out for next year. I don't need taxes. Which was true. And he didn't write the story. And he came back to me after the election. He said, you know, it was because I trusted you that I didn't write that story. But otherwise, probably I would have written it. So that would have hurt, that would have been harmful. The other thing I got involved with, I mean, apart from just running the government well, was during the campaign, Bateman had taken the position that he was going to repeal the income tax. And that was a foolish position. I don't think he believed in it. And so people kept asking him, well, if you repeal the income tax, what are you going to do? And there was no answer to that question. And he kept trying to dodge that. And as I heard, and I had friends, you know, we weren't as partisan in those days. I had friends on both sides, friends in his campaign. But as I heard afterwards, he, you know, he's a man of integrity, and he said to his people, look, I'm not going out in public anymore and not being honest with the people I'm talking to. You either tell me what I'm going to do or I'm going to say something else. What am I going to do if I repeal the income tax? And so they came up with this, what we call the BS plan, the Bateman-Simon plan. Now, from my work in over by then 3 years of budgets, you know, I had collected all the proposals that the Republican Party had made in opposition to all our budgets. And I had them written down, handwritten in my desk drawer, like numbered. The proposal and the 1 or 2 sentence rebuttal of the proposal. And I had these, and you know, in Trenton, there's only a few people involved in all of this stuff. They're not finding out new things from some outside source. They have the same few staff people in the legislature and so forth. So I felt that whatever Bateman would come up with, I had it.
You thought he would recycle some other Republican idea of the past 3 years.
Right. That was it. That was the shopping list that he had to choose from. What else, you know, what other ideas are there that they hadn't come up with over these 3 years? So I had them all. And then he made his presentation at a press conference in Newark. I think it was on a Friday. And somebody called.
How deep into the campaign season do you think we are?
Pretty late.
September-ish?
Yeah. I don't really remember, but it was late because there's a buildup of pressure on him to get this out. Maybe it was September. And someone called me on Friday and read to me what he had said. And I said to Dee, put down on a memo number 1, number 6, number 11, number 14, number 32. So, and write a memo, which we did and gave to the governor. And that day, the governor had a press conference using that and demolished the abatement plan.
Called it the BS plan that,
yes, called
that
it,
day?
Yes. And it was one of those, you know, these arguments can go on back and forth for weeks and months in political life, but this one was demolished in that one session. It was dead.
Was that the election, do you think?
Hmm?
Do you think that
I
was
think
the election?
I think it played a role. I don't really know. You know, it was important.
Do you think Bateman's tax position was taken during the primary when he had to
That's what I've been told.
go to the right a little bit on
I've been
to win
told
the primary?
that Kane took that position in the primary and Bateman was forced into that. But I don't really know that.
Did you feel that the press coverage of the tax issue tended to endorse the Byrne position on the tax?
Yeah, I thought so. I thought it did, and I mean, of course, we didn't have that. We had opponents, you know, and it was different than what Florio faced. Florio, they attacked. The press was became like a radio station, and they attacked Florio. We didn't have that. I mean, we had people for it, against it, and the people who were against it, you know, the protesters came down, and there's some lady naked in a barrel and some guy with a stove. You know, they looked foolish. I mean, it wasn't.
It wasn't as vitriolic as...
It was not vitriolic.
You saw vitriol at the Meadowlands in September, but by the time of the election season, it had dissipated somewhat?
But it wasn't. It was vitriolic in some quarters, I suppose. But I thought the press, in general, was favorable toward it.
At what point did you realize that Brendan Byrne was going to beat Ray Bateman?
I always thought that, but I wasn't, you know, reading polls and being involved in the campaign. I had no idea, but I just thought he would win. I don't know why, but I think because I thought, since I merged with the public on 20 out of 21 bond issues, I understood what they were going to do.
Do you think the public is intelligent? Do you think the electorate is an intelligent electorate?
I do.
Did you have any role in, I mean, did you brief the governor personally the day of the Bateman-Simon plan?
Yes.
You did. And who did you ask to put
My secretary.
Your secretary.
Yeah.
Did you have any thoughts about what you would do personally if he lost the election?
Nope.
Do you remember election night?
I don't remember now.
Do you remember
I must have been happy.
Do you remember what your reaction was?
I must have just been happy. I don't think I was there at some celebration or anything like that.
Think you were home watching television?
Probably. Well, maybe watching you.
I hadn't started there yet.
Okay.
So now there's a second administration to begin and to map out. What do you recall about the transition into a second administration?
The first meeting I had with the governor after the election was probably in January. And I don't remember exactly how this happened, but what was on the table was that I should get rid of Earl Josephson from purchasing property.
Why?
And the reasoning was that he was rude to people and his office was a mess and he didn't say good morning when he walked through the State House. But that wasn't the reason, you know. And I just figured some people in the legislature or some political people, you know, couldn't get around Earl, and or he said no too much, whatever. But before this came up, I made it pretty clear in a nice, subtle way to whoever the staff person was that it would not be. I probably couldn't work in the Treasury without Earl Josephson there. So by the time I got to talk to the governor about it, he didn't push it as an idea. He just said, well, let's see how it works for 6 months. And I said, fine. And it was never raised again.
Did you talk to Earl?
No. Later, after we left office, I think I probably told him about it. But he, I think, had heard about it somewhere else. But I meant it, you know.
So the governor's somebody in the governor's office wanted Earl out.
Somebody, I don't know who.
And in essence, you threatened to quit if they forced him out.
Well, I didn't threaten, but I think they understood I would.
Would you have?
Yes. As I quit the Meadowlands thing when they reached in and took out my council, because I wouldn't be responsible for, you know, what someone else did under me in my name that I didn't approve of. So, and we had, I think they understood that. The governor was very nice about it. He didn't push it. You know, my secretary was the niece of the governor's secretary, and I'm sure they ran the government more than we did. So whatever conversations might have had to happen happened that way.
Was
I'm
that
guessing?
Do you think that was a fruitful channel?
It was. I don't know. I assume it was. And part of the whole thing was, you know, my secretary was very sophisticated and he wouldn't say anything, so I just figured it was fine, whatever.
Did you have any particular policy goals that you brought with you to the second term?
Well, first of all, I wanted the tax program to work and not to require taxes again, which is what happened. There was one part of the corporate tax in the original package that didn't get enacted in the original package, and that was enacted afterward. But
what kind of a part of the corporate tax?
I don't really remember.
Did it raise corporate taxes?
Yes, but it wasn't a major thing. And I don't remember what it was. But it was not done when it was as part of the total package. It was part of the original package, and then it had to be done after that. But other than that, we went through those 4 years, and that was a good accomplishment that it worked. Then we had to build the arena. We had to build the justice complex and I mean, there were a lot of things. There was. I mean, it's hard to remember everything because we're involved in everything. But for example, Lou Gambassini was creating New Jersey Transit, which was a great accomplishment. And he was a great man and a wonderful commissioner of transportation. But his plan didn't make sense. So
financially?
Financially. Because basically they were buying the bus company of PSE&G. And it was a losing proposition, kept alive only by state subsidy, so it wasn't worth much. But PSE&G had offered to sell this whole thing for a small amount of cash, a few $1,000,000, and we would take over the pension obligation of the bus drivers and employees. So I had a young guy on my staff. My staff was 3 people besides me.
Who?
Dave Beal, Bruce Ackerman, this young fellow, also a lawyer, and Joan Stevens. And Joan's main job was going to these authorities and keeping track of them. And Bruce analyzed this plan and said, look, in effect, we're paying $100 million worth of pension obligations by assuming those. So that's the floor. So I told Lou that, you know, we couldn't go along with this. He needed to do a better job, and he got all excited. You know, he really wanted to get this done. And it was up to me to find him the money. You know, if it cost, instead of $5 million, $15 million, it was my problem. I was willing to take it on. But anyway, we had a big meeting at Transportation, a lot of people. I went over with Bruce, and I mean, they kept trying to say the same thing over and over again, and I kept saying, look, we're not going to do this, and I left. You know, I left Bruce, and they really attacked Bruce Gambasini, you know, and he really felt terrible about it. So I called Gambasini and I let him have it. You know, this is just not fair to take it out on this young guy. You know, he's just it all worked itself out, and we did get the bus company under our terms, and he got the credit. We weren't, you know.
You didn't have to pay $100 million
No,
in
we
pensions?
didn't. They kept their pension obligation. We just paid for the bus company, and we paid a little more without assuming the pensions than if we had assumed them. It worked out fine. But, I mean, there were things, aside from the big issues that people know about, we were involved in everything, one way or another. There was one, you know, we had on top of everything else, we had a water crisis. I forget which year that was, but there was a water shortage. So the governor had, Jerry English was DEP, and they had a water czar under Jerry in charge of all this water stuff.
I think it was 79, actually.
Yeah. So one night, Jerry English comes into my office, maybe 5:30, 6 o'clock. I need a waiver of advertising for $10 million to build this pipeline from Lake Patcon to, you know, some...
Waiver of advertising meaning no
bidding. No bidding on the construction of the pipeline.
Just hire somebody.
Yeah. I mean, they had the person. And it's an emergency. I said, look, I called Lendy Donato and I said, here's what she's proposing to do. And
his position was? Head
of Buildings and Construction. He would be the one to recommend the waiver of advertising. And he said, look, it's 6 o'clock. They're not going to start work tonight. I'll get 3 bids by 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon, including hers. Not public bids, but proposals from 3 different. And then we'll know that we did it the right way. Which she didn't want to accept, but she had to because I wasn't signing. So Len interviewed this company. Her company was a company that did dredging on the New Jersey shore. And their plan was to take down one of their barges, disassemble it, truck it up to Lake Patcon, float it up there with the water pumps, and then have the pipes going to wherever they were supposed to go. And Len said to the guy, well, this is a contract between October and March. What happens if Lake Patcon freezes? And he goes, oh, we'd have to pull the barge because it would capsize. So he was out. So it wasn't only the $10 million. It just didn't work. And the second, the one who did it, turned out to have this fancy steel, a concrete-coated steel pipe that had been going to Iran, but because of the hostage crisis and the embargo and all that, he was stuck with this pipe. So we got this pipe for nothing, and it became a permanent installation up there instead of, building plastic pipe on the surface. So those are the kinds of things we would just, every day there would be some other.
Who else was in the cabinet who stands out in your memory, or who you interacted with?
Well, in the early days, it was Anne Klein, who I liked very much. We had a similar thing once with her about a contract, lesser importance, and we stood our ground and bid something she wanted waived, and we saved half the money, and I said, yeah, you see, now you can build two of them. So, but the one interesting thing, right at the beginning, when I was deputy treasurer, there was a problem at DYFS, the Youth and Family Services, and I was asked to head up a task force to review DYFS. So we got a group together from the Budget Bureau and elsewhere, and they went over there. And on the first day, they discovered, well, maybe not the first day, the first few days, that the person running this residential youth division had a gap in the resume, his resume. And when they checked out his resume further, they found out he was a fugitive and the FBI was looking for him or something. I forget even what the charge had to do with weapons. So I reported this to Dick and Lou Caden and the governor right away, and they called Ann in. And I mean, this was not a good situation, so the governor basically
This
said,
person was the director of the division, or he was the head of a residential facility?
No, the director of the division. And basically it was obvious that this person had to go. But Ann started defending this person. And she was saved by Lou Caden, because the governor was ready to fire her too, because I think, I'm watching, and I don't know him that well, but, he was a prosecutor and a judge, and this didn't make any sense. It didn't make sense for her to defend the person either. But Lou Caden stepped into the middle of this and said, I think we should take a little break and let me talk to Ann, and we'll come back. And I mean, he was great.
Yeah?
Yeah. And
Great
so
at what?
Just seeing had wisdom, how to deal with people and seeing the outcome of something and anticipating. And he was a good person.
So how long a break did he mean?
10 minutes.
A 10-minute break?
And at the end of that, it was done, and she agreed, and this fellow was let go. Later, years later, was arrested for some burglary ring at one of these youth residential things on the shore somewhere, using the kids as part of some gang. It's like, how he got back there, I don't know. But but that was, and we got along pretty well, the cabinet. Oh, I had an interesting one in the election year with Hollander too. This was John Degnan came to me one day, and he said, "You got to help out in this situation."
Degnan at the time was counsel or
was
attorney
either
general?
counsel or attorney general. I don't. This was in the election year, '77. Counsel. Executive secretary. Said the Department of Higher Education, the Board of Higher Education, had just hired Hollander to be chancellor. And Hollander, and they had offered him a house, a state house. Now, we had been getting rid of state houses for whoever. Burke had one. The previous chancellor had one, but we sold it in Princeton. And we were, you know, like the head of Jersey City State College wanted a house in Teaneck. And we said, look, if there's a house on the campus and they want to have it, and anyway, it doesn't, that's one thing, but we're not giving him a house in Teaneck, you know, so and then we had one where Thomas Edison College, which is the college without walls, where you get a degree for life experience and so forth. They had a new person and got a memo that she wants a house, and I said, if she's running a college without walls, get her a house without walls. So we were pretty consistent on this policy, and now Hollander was offered this house, and the governor didn't want him to have it. The governor said, nobody asked me. You know, it goes against our position. He's not getting a house. And so...
Had he come from out of state, or was he in
state? From New York State. He's a good guy. So Degnan, you know, was afraid that there would be a conflict in this election year between the governor and the people on the Board of Higher Education, and it would cause a lot of flap and blah, blah. Although the governor's position, I thought, was the better position, and in a flap it would have helped him. But John wanted, and John failed to be able to mediate this fight. So he asked if I would. So I went and see the governor, or we were at some event, and I said to him, you know, I hear there's this problem. Why don't we get Hollander a house in Trenton like Burke has? And it's good for the city, too. And Byrne had a thing about helping Trenton. So he agreed to that. And that was a good Solomon-like solution until I talked to Hollander, and Hollander said, no, no, it has to be in Princeton. I'm not having a house in Trenton. My daughter needs special education things. So now I was stuck, you know. So then I got this idea. We were renovating Morven. We were renovating Drumthwacket to replace Morven as the governor's residence. But Drumthwacket was empty. And I had the idea, well, he could move into Drumthwacket. I mean, it's there. We already own it. And there's an apartment on the second floor, nice. You know, it's a mansion. It'd be nice. It's in Princeton. So I went to the governor with this idea, and he reluctantly agreed to that. Partly because it would help expedite the renovation, I think. So then I called Hollander, and I had things to do, you know. This was like I had a budget to make. This was like on the side, you know. This was at the expense of I couldn't see my kids, you know. So, and I called Hollander, and I arranged for him to go with his wife and see. I mean, you're talking about the most beautiful house in the state of New Jersey. And he called back and he said, it's too
drafty,
too removed. It was I said, well, I don't want to repeat the language I used, but I told him where to go back to New York. I'm finished with this. You know, something like that. I have no more time to do this. So you're not getting a house, just go back to New York. And then he agreed to
take it.
And that's what happened. So we had relationships of different types with different cabinet officers, but well, we had when Hollander came, Fred Burke sent out invitations to everybody to have a welcome dinner for Hollander at his house. So I said to Hofgesang, you know, that invitation came with state postage on it. So I said, yeah. So we went to this party, and it was a nice party, and they had, you know, catered filet, steak, champagne, toast, and then the bill came to the state for reimbursement, and we rejected it. We're not allowed to pay for state. You know, we thought it was you, Fred, personal, but we can't pay for this, and we didn't. And so we had different relationships with different people, but we, we were involved in pretty much everything that happened.
What do you recall about cabinet meetings?
Well, the few that I recall were the few that I mentioned that I had some minor thing to say. But on the whole, I don't remember them as being very useful. And just like I didn't have division director meetings after the first one.
No.
Because people had different interests and different, there was very little in common to talk about that would be relevant to to the tax division as well as the purchase and property division. So we didn't have division, and the cabinet meetings were like that too.
Were they a waste of time?
No, I mean you got to see people and hear what they were thinking about.
Did Byrne preside over them, or did he let somebody else preside?
No, he presided, but it was fairly informal, as I remember.
In the first term, the governor's office was restructured with a chief of staff and a policy, and in the second term, I'm sorry, and a policy and planning office. Did that change help or hurt?
Didn't matter to me, except I lost my parking space to Bob Mulcahy, but chief of staff. But it didn't matter to me, and I don't remember. You were the head of that, right, Donnelly? I don't remember being involved too much with it.
Was the governor's office staff much smaller in those days than it is today?
I think so. Well, up until policy and planning, it was really small, and they had the council's office, and they had responsibilities. They had the chief of staff or whatever, the assistant to the governor. I don't know what secretary to the governor. It wasn't chief of staff at that point, and Lou Caden and his counsel, and there were a few people. Now I think it's enormous. I think the present governor has cut it back by a third from what it was. But I think it's a hindrance to an efficient government.
How so?
Because it takes simple decisions and makes them complicated, and cuts the communications and confuses things and creates the need for lots of meetings, and a lot of people feel like they have to be part of everything, and there's, it just adds layers and layers of complication.
Do you think even in this current day and age, a smaller governor's staff would be able to make decisions more efficiently?
Yeah, I do.
One of Governor Byrne's major goals was urban renewal.
Could we take a break?
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm over.
One of Brendan Byrne's major goals was urban renewal. In retrospect, did he accomplish anything in that area?
I don't know that I'm encyclopedic on this topic, but a few things that we were involved with. The medical school we built. I think it wasn't his idea to build one, but we built it, and I think that had a great positive impact on Newark.
Which medical school?
The one in Newark. And we helped out in the New Brunswick one too with that savings we made. I was involved. We tried to get the American Stock Exchange, which was looking for a new home, to move to Jersey City. And I put together like sales packages about Jersey City with the mayor, and tax incentive things and all that. And we had a decent shot. And Arthur Levitt was somehow involved at the time, I remember. But anyway, we had a lot of meetings and circulated this thing and I have a feeling that helped set the stage for later promotion of the Jersey City Gold Coast. And I remember after the Sports Authority financing was done, I had a private meeting with Donald Regan, who was the head of Merrill Lynch. Merrill Lynch had underwritten the Sports Authority bond issue. And I arranged to have, and we rode around in his limousine for this meeting, and the purpose was to ask him to promote, through his influence with the American Stock Exchange, to promote the Jersey City site, but it didn't work. But the publicity from it, I'm sure, was helpful. I wouldn't, I mean, our involvement, my involvement with cities at the time was, in Trenton to get the office buildings, to keep the tax rates down, but I wasn't involved in urban renewal programs.
How about race relations? Did Byrne accomplish anything in the area of race relations?
I don't know how to answer that either.
How were race relations in New Jersey in the 1970s?
Better than in the 60s. I don't know. There was a lot of attention to, because of the riots, to try to bring more equity to life in New Jersey and the cities.
Do you think that...
But it's hard, it's a hard thing to do. The school thing was intended primarily to help urban areas and to boost their educational equity and so forth. Whether it did that or lowered taxes instead, either way was to some good. But
did Newark make progress as a city during the 70s?
I don't remember. I mean, Newark has made a lot of progress, but I don't know whether it started in the 70s. I think the 70s were pretty slack in Newark. We did a lot through the Housing Finance Agency, including in Newark. I think I told that story about how we monopolized all the federal money for these projects, and we built a lot of them in Trenton, Newark, Camden, Jersey City, all over. But that's not what people normally regard as economic development.
So you, as treasurer, you were saying that you had your most interaction with a big city mayor in Trenton itself, rather than with Mayor Gibson, or, well, you say you did interact with the mayor of Jersey City somewhat.
Well, I had dealings when it involved my area. So, yeah, we helped rescue Newark financially. We helped Jersey City. We rescued that financially. And we went with the city to the rating agencies and to the bond market to guide them through those troubled times. That's what we were doing. That was our responsibility. But as far as getting other than through EDA and getting involved in giving a subsidy to some small business, that wasn't my focus.
Did the Byrne administration? You've stressed the integrity and the commitment to honest government. Did it make it through 2 terms without scandal?
Yes, it did. I don't know if there was scandal, about some individual or something like that, but if I said this at the last time, I'm sorry, but I'll repeat it. When there was a subsequent scandal in a later administration, I ran into the governor, and he said, Governor Byrne, and he said, "Oh, I've been telling everyone that I once tried to introduce a college roommate of mine who's to underwrite some bonds, and you said no." And I said, "Well, I've been telling everyone that you never recommended anyone, so we better get our story straight." But we never had anything in our area in the state government, because as far as I know, we never did anything wrong.
Looking back, do you have any disappointments about things that you wished could have been done during Byrne's terms?
There were things left at the end. I wouldn't say disappointments, but but we just didn't finish. We didn't get to, which is always going to be the case. But I was trying to call attention to the problems in the pension funds and trying to do something about that. To the extent that we had a plan, which I don't remember what it was, to change the pension funds. And I had been meeting with Fred Hipp at NJEA, who wasn't enamored of the plan, but he wasn't hostile to it either. And I foresaw this as a coming problem for the state, which it is now in spades. But we didn't deal with it. I wanted to centralize all the money collection into the tax division, because you pay money to the Secretary of State for something, and that check wouldn't get deposited for 2 months, and we had the equipment to do it. And I also thought there were some real efficiencies possible between all the work we were doing with corporations in the tax division. The Secretary of State was dealing with corporations, and the labor and industry was dealing with corporations. And somehow all that could have been melded into one more efficient. Same thing with senior citizens. Everybody was dealing with senior citizens with their income eligibility for Medicaid and this and all these different programs, getting into state parks. And we had the information about senior citizens. We could have centralized all that and made sure everyone got what they were entitled to in all the programs. And I mean, so there were lots of things that were on the drawing board that didn't get done before we left. But the major disappointment I have is with the school finance reform stuff, because I still think it made sense the way we did it, and it was the right way to do it. And I didn't have time to follow it afterward to find out what people thought went wrong with it, and why from the end of our administration in 1982, early 82, until Florio was governor, which was like 10 years later, nothing happened in the courts. But then all of a sudden the whole thing was scrapped. Florio had a completely new plan. That was scrapped. There was another new plan, and now we have a plan that on the face of it doesn't make any sense, that only 31 districts are entitled to equal protection or quality, thorough, and efficient education compared to 500 plus districts. And I think people are now starting to figure out that there needs to be a better, newer formula. When they do that, I think our formula is the right formula in some fashion. And I just don't understand.
How did your formula differ from 31 average school districts?
I mean, the basic thing of ours was called power equalization, and we got it from school reformers at the time. It wasn't our invention. They were promoting it nationally. It meant that every district in the state, if they taxed at like $1, would raise the same amount of total dollars for education, because if Teaneck taxed at $1 and raised $1,000, and Newark taxed at $1 and raised $300, the state would pay $700. And so it was power equalization. That gave every district the same benefit based on the standard of community wealth, property wealth, to run their schools without fiscal constraints. And so, as a matter of equity, it just makes sense mathematically.
What have been the major fiscal mistakes of state government since Byrne left office?
Well, this is another 4 hours, but I'll give you a quick run-through. Sometime after we left office, the state needed money, or they thought they needed money. We're still in a recession. They cut corporate taxes. They wanted to increase welfare payments, which was fine, and they needed money. They exaggerated how much they needed, but that's what you do. The governor, Kane, wanted a sales tax increase. The Democrats in the legislature wanted an income tax increase. There was a battle over it, and it was one of those things where they said, we won't give you a sales tax unless you also take an income tax. Like, don't throw me in the briar patch, so in politics. So Kane got both, and the recession ended. So he had a lot of money. That's a bigger problem in some ways than having too little money, because you can't say no to people, and you build in expenses that keep growing. By the end of his second term, he was out of money, and the state, Florio inherited a deficit in the current year that he became governor, which had never happened before. And
Kane didn't inherit a deficit from Byrne?
No, we left a $130 million surplus, which in those days was significant. I mean, the budget might have been $5 billion. But in the following year, they did have a problem. But depends how you looked at it, whether they could have solved that problem simply or not with controlling spending. But anyway, I'm not criticizing what they did, but they wound up with a lot of money, more than they needed. And then it's very difficult to say no to somebody and show a huge surplus and not give money to health care or to hospitals or this or that or employees. And they gave medical benefits in retirement to all the teachers, and the cost of living on the pensions was made an entitlement. So a lot of spending was built in. And then they ended by spending off surplus in the following year. Was a huge problem, and that's what hit Florio when he came into office. And then when Florio imposed all the taxes, they weren't enough for the problem. And there was another recession. And then they repealed the sales tax that he increased, and some of the spending, but not all, and they sort of exacerbated the problem that he already had, so that when he left office, there was a problem for Whitman. So when Whitman came in, instead of dealing with that problem, she cut taxes. And she, in 1994, changed the whole pension system around so as to eliminate essentially all the pension contribution, brought it from $1 billion down to almost zero, by deferring the payments to the future and spending off the health care funding that had been accumulated to take care of the retirees' health care. And then introduced spending programs like the school construction thing. It's a valid thing, valuable thing, but $12 billion bond issue requires $1 billion a year of debt service. Someone has to pay that out of something. That wasn't provided, and I mean, there's a whole litany of things that, but basically left the state in very, very, very poor financial condition, so that when McGreevey took over, he had a $6 billion gap in his first budget and a $3 billion deficit in the year that he was taking over, which is impossible. I mean, Florio ended his first year in office with a $1 million surplus in the state, after having cut $590 million of current year contracts. So he was left with a $590 million problem in mid-year, and McGreevey had $3 billion. Plus, the state hadn't put any money into the pension funds since 1994, except for the bond issue they put in, and that kept going until 2003, because the statute in '97 said you don't have to put in any money. So they didn't put any money in. So for 10 years. Now, if they had put in $1 billion a year for 10 years, and it was earning money at the rates that you earned during the mid-'90s, you wouldn't have these pension problems you have today. But I mean, this would require hours. But there's a very sorry story here. It goes on for 20 years of a situation which right now is I think, very, very serious.
You think the state's in worse fiscal shape than in your adult lifetime right
Yes,
now?
right now.
How do you feel about such current proposals as school district and municipal consolidation, new spending caps at the local level?
Well, the consolidation issue I've commented on publicly in the past, and I assume that there are ways to make things more efficient than they are today. But I don't see this as a broad solution to these problems that we have at the local level. I was at a meeting when McGreevey was governor with some professors, and this was being discussed, and I said, well, you know, take a bunch of towns, like let's say in Hudson County, some small towns, and Weehawken and West New York, Gutenberg and all, and add up those towns until they have the same population as Jersey City. And then let's find out whether those towns or Jersey City operates more efficiently. Do that kind of analysis and see whether you would save money or whether it would cost you money. And that kind of analysis hasn't been done. But I don't think you're going to get towns to combine in any large-scale way.
I'm sorry. I thought I had this turned off. Sorry about that.
So I don't think you, and I think a lot of the savings you could force more easily by doing the functions better. For example, school transportation was always an issue where people would say, well, if we didn't have to skirt this town, if we could pick up, you know, where one town juts into another town, we could pick up kids from both towns, we could do it, we could save millions of dollars. And if that's true, you don't have to merge the two school districts to accomplish that. You just set up a new system of bus transportation which would allow you to do that. I think that's a diversion, but a popular one that's not going to go away. You know, Alan Karcher wrote that book, and people focus on it, and Whitman had a property tax study commission, and that's what they came out with. But you know, in Princeton we had 4 referenda to merge the 2 Princetons, and they always failed. And I don't think necessarily you'd save money, because if you have 2 towns, let's say with 2 different police forces, they would both be earning what the higher one is earning, not what the lower one is earning. So you'd save 1 chief of police, but you'd have 2 deputy chiefs, and then you'd have everyone making more money than they were before.
So spending caps.
Well, we had spending caps in the Byrne program. They weren't caps on the levy. They were caps on the spending, and it was tied to inflation. And we found out it was a problem with the bond market, first of all, because they felt you could, you know, if you had an artificial statutory impediment to someone paying their debt service, this was a problem. So we exempted that. And I don't know. I guess over the years people feel it hasn't really worked, but I don't see how you could make it work much better. And the problem is what people spend money on is what people want, you know. And I do work for some cities now and as a financial consultant, and you know, the cities basically provide a police force and a fire department and public works, and they pick up garbage and fix the sewers. And, I mean, they don't do a lot of frills. They don't have a lot of people not working.
What have you been doing since you left the government?
Well, for a few years I taught at the Woodrow Wilson School part-time, and I've been consulting to mainly cities.
In New Jersey or beyond?
Mainly in New Jersey. I don't like to travel. But, you know, Newark and Patterson and
A minute left on this tape.
Then let's take this minute. Any final thoughts on Brendan Byrne as a person?
Well, the further away you get, the even better he looks to me. I admire two people greatly in my career. One was Richard Hughes, and one was Brendan Byrne. And you know, thinking back just to prepare for this, for example, all the different things that have stood the test of time that we accomplished, that we haven't even talked about, the casinos and other things, New Jersey Transit and EDA on the right. All these things have lasting improvements to the state. So, I mean, I think he was a terrific governor, and I, mean that. As was Hughes, and they did a lot of good.
Let's leave it there.
Good.